Good evening. You can respond. Good evening on a rainy night in LA. I'm very pleased tonight to introduce a friend, a former student, very respected colleague, Hansi Beder Baratza, um, partner in Studio Luz in Boston, and also a professor at Rhode Island School of Design. Hansi Beder and her partner in Studio Luz, Anthony T.J. Piermarini, are former students of mine from Cornell, the Cornell days. Hansi was in one of my theory courses on race and architecture, and her husband and partner T.J. Was actually my teaching assistant at Harvard when I taught there in 1999. I've really been in awe of Hansi since Cornell because she was always, I don't know if she came out of the womb, talented, immensely talented, hungry for knowledge, fearless, and joyous, all at the same time. And all those qualities have really produced what you see today. An inspiring academic leader, a tenacious voice for architecture's role in creating a better society for all, including the 99%, not just the 1%. She has been outspoken on gender equity in the profession, racial consciousness, and has integrated these themes into her teaching, academic administrative work, and her research and practice. The title of Hansi's lecture this evening is Negotiating Identity. And I think that when the history of digital fabrication is written, it will include various family trees, captions and footnotes, and I think Hansi will no doubt appear, or should appear, in this compendium because she really has grown up in the digital culture and has utilized new digital tools and machineries of production to produce and create works really at all scales. But she's also exceeded the sometimes narrow obsessions that have overcome some to ascend to a new place in her practice and in the discourse of what comes next. For Hansi, digital fabrication is not a means unto itself. It is part of a larger toolkit from which the architect drives meaning in their work. The architect, with a trifecta of social agency, political agency, and aesthetic spatial agency, attacks problems and seeks to exploit opportunities with a sense of purpose and an ethical disposition derived from their own human identity. Born in Barranquilla, Colombia, Hansi received her Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University in 1997 and a Master's in Architecture and Urban Design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design in 2000. In 1999, she was construction supervisor for Habitat for Humanity in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Didn't know that I knew that. It's on your CV, by the way. She also worked as an architectural intern and designer at Kennedy Volich Architecture in Boston, and as a project designer and manager at Office Da Architecture and Urban Design. In 2002, she co-founded Studio Luz Architects, a progressive architecture firm that serves a diverse client base in residential, commercial, institutional, and cultural projects. The firm has been recognized as one of Architectural Records' Design Vanguard, and the work has garnered many local and national design awards. Additionally, Hansi is a co-founder of Brace, a nonprofit that builds new community spaces that engage social, economic, and cultural issues facing communities around the world. As a professor of architecture at the RISD Architecture School, Hansi has also deepened her commitment to socially engaged architecture through academic research and teaching. Her book, Where Are the Utopian Visionaries? Architecture of Social Exchange by Prestel Press, published 5 years ago. Really great book. engages in the exchange of ideas, techniques, and visions of a more socially just and diverse understanding for the discipline of architecture, where those people historically relegated to silence and invisibility are given real agency. She has also been a visiting critic at Cornell University, Boston Architectural College, a lecturer at MIT and Northeastern, and as I said, is currently professor. She was graduate program director at RISD for several years and now is a professor at RISD. It's really fantastic to have her here. Please join me in welcoming Hansi Beder-Peraza.
Thanks. We're a small group, so I would love it if you got up your chairs and come really close to me. Come close to me. I love creating community. I want to thank Dean Milton Curry for that wonderful introduction. I feel that he framed the whole work, and I can now demonstrate slides and slides of work and kind of demonstrate the trajectories and the path that I have undertaken in the last 16 years. So thank you so much for getting close. Studio Luz Architects. Studio Luz Architects strives to link social concepts with built material expression. And what I mean by that is we look at architecture as a backdrop. We look at architecture as a clean slate where we find that through the arrangements of furniture, one can create kind of conversation. Through the ideas of the body and how the body is positioned in space, we create encounters. And we also look at the much more urban scale in terms of how do we begin to assemble buildings within a larger block to create community. As Milton said, I titled the lecture Negotiating Identity, and I'm hoping that I can present a very humble and honest, let's say, path and understanding the work after 16 years in practice. Doesn't matter. Here you have Gertie Yolanda Besosa. In 1945, she was the first Puerto Rican women architect to be licensed in the Caribbean. She also graduated from Cornell. And what I find really fascinating about this newspaper clipping in 1945, she's here rendered in three representations. The one at the top that you see is the architect as studious, position, ready to work. She's also represented here as someone that is very comfortable in loose garment and loose fitting, almost in a sexualized kind of way in terms of being free but also being objectified. And then here in 1945, you see the idea that women is in the kitchen and is reinforcing women as a reproductive, let's say, species, right? So what I find really fascinating here is that in 1945, we have here a kind of a tradition of framing the women architect in a lot of different roles. So negotiating identity, what don't I do? So I was interviewing a podcast for Oh Hell No. It's an Oh Hell No podcast. And I found it really fascinating that that in the podcast interview, Nicole framed me as a licensed architect, as a business owner, as an author, as a professor. And I find myself in that kind of framework already that has been put forward to me, one that has many different kind of jobs and occupations. So in looking at identity, who am I? Who am I? How do I consider my identity, and how is my identity important into the ways in which I project the work and how it's read to the users? So in terms of my identity, I was born in Barranquilla, Colombia. Colombia, in terms of racial groups, we are descendants of 3 European, indigenous, African. We, as you know, with the popular DNA, we have multiple ethnicities, different heritage. when I was doing the first public art project, the Big Hammock, it was really important when I was asked, well, actually, when I created this large hammock to suspend 20 bodies in the air for allowing social bodies to come together and have conversation, I needed to find a way that I can talk about a multiple group, even though I wanted to project where hammocks came from in terms of the indigenous culture. I looked at colors, and very quickly you see yellow, blue, red, and I wanted, what was really fascinating about the way that the hammock was woven is that people from Venezuela said, oh, this hammock is Venezuelan. Oh, this hammock represents, is American, is US. And I found it really interesting how multiple identities were being projected in the fabric and the texture by the ways in which I kind of blurred the sequencing and the combinations of that identity. In terms of the Big Hammock project, it was installed in the Rose Kennedy Greenway. It was one of the first interactive public art on the Greenway. It was completely initiated, fundraised, put forth as an idea, presented it to the city, presented to the Greenway Conservatory, and implemented it. During that time, I visited an indigenous community, the Wayuu, in the Guajira region, close to the border of Venezuela, and I was really struck by how the indigenous Wayuu would actually have their housing structures, their posts and beams, as part of the structural framework for the loom of the fabric. And so what it did, it provided me a structural idea and system to create the loom right out of this 40-foot long structure. So that because it was pretty much 2,600 linear feet of rope, which is almost 5.5 times the length of the Hancock Building, the Boston Hancock Building. So the idea of creating the loom, the structural loom, and then creating the warp, which is the main kind of structural rope, and then the warp. You can see here that we needed to create a very long needle to weave the fabric together, and the idea was basically to put this in the Greenway, where a lot of neighborhoods kind of abutted that area. So you have Chinatown, the financial district, you have the Seaport district, all kind of being along this mile-long Greenway. And what we created was performances. So it took 4 days to actually weave this whole structure. It was a performance piece. We wanted to make sure that people in the financial district would look at the labor that's involved in the product, and we would kind of provide brochures to people to let them know where hammocks came from. So there was kind of a conscious decisions to know where things came from. We had the Big Hammock Song performance on the space, and we also produced a book in 3 different languages because we were just next to Chinatown. We produced English, Spanish, and Mandarin, a book to have readings to children coming to this public space. And again, we wanted to find a way in which people that didn't necessarily know each other can just start talking to one another to spark conversations. In terms of cultural, in terms of the identity, that was particular something that I would say that my identity kind of matter, and I wanted to share that. When you're working in your own practice, you have other cultures and other interests. And what we found in the beginning of our practice, we were doing a lot of restaurant projects, and we would be asked to do an Indian restaurant, a Japanese restaurant. And we thought that those were fantastic program to explore ideas of culture and how do you begin to represent culture. So this Finn's was a Japanese sushi restaurant, and what we found really fascinating were these torii gates, which are basically gifts given for the merchants as a gift to the public. And the torii gates are also these kind of sacred threshold spaces. And we use that as kind of a concept to go from the urban life and to enter into kind of a new space. And we created these structural ribs along the space. And what we did was basically we worked perceptually with these lines and if you and kind of gaps within the lines, so it feels like it was a river, like you had this kind of noise vibration throughout the space. And so what we did is we incorporated LED lightings through slot. So as you were kind of going through the space, you felt a sense of movement through those projected lines. In terms of gathering, I was very fascinated by visiting Brazil and how people eat there. Usually furniture, one sits right next to each other instead of in front of each other. So we found a way in which the ways in which you would eat these kind of structural ribs would support the tabletops to allow for one to be closer to one another. In terms of the joint, as Milton mentioned in introduction, we did grow up kind of in the digital world. We knew we were very facile with CAD/CAM technologies. It was a really good way for us to work directly with materials when you're first growing your practice. We designed these. We took influence from kind of origami, and we developed these, I would say, flexible joints. And the idea about flexible joints for us is we wanted to create a frame that was both post and beam. And we called this kind of an architecture of joints, and we were really fascinated by men's collars and these joints. Can you find a way to remove the categorizations of structural systems by creating flexible joints? And that's how we created continuous rigid frames. So the idea here is that the frames which incorporate the lighting also extended like a waiter. When a waiter comes and provides you with a menu or with a wine bottle, it also provided kind of a shelf for for the soy sauce and the containers and the menus for the space. So in terms of another kind of motivator for the practice was similar to you as an undergraduate student. When I was at Cornell, I found it the motivation, like how does one begin to produce work that begins to have conversations about the things that you felt were unjust in your educational system. And so, motivation for me in terms of being determined to have alive conversations of something that I found just annoying was basically an insult that during school I had professors constantly showing me Carlo Molino's work, the futuristic architect that practiced in mid-20th century, and basically the objectification of women I found highly disturbing, and how the body was kind of contextualized in the actual plan, that you literally take a torso. I felt that the woman's body was a colonized figure, literally would take the shape of the woman and put it on the table. And I felt like for you to take the profile and put it on a table for you to eat from, I felt was perverse in some ways, that you can touch her, you can control her body. And so when we were asked to do an Indian restaurant, Diva Lounge in Somerville, all of the projects are basically in Boston and Cambridge area. I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to look at the silhouette, to look at the contour figure of both male and female. And so what we began to do was to take the profiles and begin to remove the material. So similar to the way that Gordon Marter Clark, the artist, would use the cut to remove the distance between the object and the subject, or the house, the interior, by showing the interior, you're somehow exposing and removing any kind of imagination. It is what it is. That's what we're also doing by removing the surface where two strangers might be next to each other and provide a surface of flirtatious, let's say, connections or touch. We were trying to let that be a moment, an encounter of togetherness versus kind of the separation of different bodies. The Diva tapas were completely enclosed with prefab replacement domes that you see in skylights. So this was very, at that time when we did Diva Lounge in Somerville, it was a very kind of avant-garde project because in interiors for restaurants, you only can have, let's say, 10% be of a different surface or in terms of fabric. And so you couldn't really clad the whole interior without sprinkler systems of, let's say, different materials. So what we did is we said, well, it's a lighting atmosphere. It's not really a decorative surface. It's called decorative surface. You can't have more than 90% being decorative surface. It could only be 10%. So the way that we got through fire codes was to basically say this is a lighting cladding, a lighting interior is not a surface at all. It's a lighting. So we were able to convince the fire department that this was okay in terms of working within their codes. The door had two eyes, and it was a way of showing the reflection. Like you don't really see what you see. You think you might know something, but you don't. So this idea of the inversion of the two mirrors as you approach is a way, again, to make people stop and think before entering into a project, to a space. We created a lighting based on where we thought social condensers might actually occur along the bar, and that became kind of the lighting scheme, lighting plan. I was always very influenced too by Eva Hesse, and I really loved these art pieces that Eva Hesse would do, and I found that women and men, we share the same thing, right? So I was looking at nipples and how nipples are shared by both genders, and so I wanted to create a nipple table. And the reason I wanted to create a nipple table is because I wanted people to fawn the table while they waited for their food. So here's another kind of idea that whenever chance I have to make people stop and think about our difference or our similarities and have fun while doing it, we do that with our projects. In terms of one of the requests from our clients, it's a bar. So what happens at a bar really late at night? People have accidents, right? They vomit, right? And so they said, can you think of a texture that we don't see the vomit late at night when everyone is drunk? And literally, we had to respond to that. And what we did is we used rubber mat, a slip mat foam as a formwork to play with plaster. And so that's what we did to create this kind of bumpy surface with the pods, with the domes. Each of these are bathrooms. And what we did is we wanted to just create these insular pod conditions to allow for the socialization to occur on the outside. We didn't want to differentiate men and female bathrooms. In terms of genre, we were also asked by Harpoon. I don't know how many of you are from Boston, but Harpoon is a brewery. It received its first brewery license in Massachusetts. I don't know if you have Harpoon here. It's a really well-known brand. The owners asked if we can design a beer hall that had a very kind of German feel to it, a beer garden. And so we were given this kind of industrial space, and we created the space where all you would see is basically large tabletops to create kind of that social condensing gathering space. So the beer hall, this is the long kind of beer hall. We needed to have it was an industrial building owned by the city. We had to create kind of an identity from the beginning, from the entrance. There was a retail component where you would sell the clothing products of Harpoon, and then you would enter the beer hall before you went into the tasting. So there needed to be kind of a connection to see the microbrewing process and the beer hall. And you can see that that was part of the industrial building, which is right near the seaport. And I was really happy I always look online to see if our project is successful or not. And this made me really happy right here. Props to the brewery for the view of Boston from the urinals at the beer hall. You probably think I'm obsessed with the bathroom, right? I am obsessed with the bathroom. So here you would see, this is the bathroom of the urinals overlooking the sky, and you're going to see the view in a second. I am here with owners, all men. Typically, it's always presenting to men as a majority, and they were so excited to have a view of the skyline. You know, they wanted to project and see the skyline. And I made sure that the women, and this is why representation matters and why women need to be at the table, I made sure that women can also have that view. And I did it through their sinks, because you still need kind of privacy. So here's the view that they were really kind of striving for and going for. So representation matters. And this is I'm obsessed with gender, and it's only because of my experience developing a practice from nothing to something. What are the struggles along the way? So representation, the Pritzker Prize, out of 41 or 42 Pritzker winners, they're still all men. We only have one out of, let's say, 41 or 42, we only have one Zaha Hadid, and we have two that are with partners. And then I was very happy to see Balakrishna Doshi being the winner, because he actually wrote in my book. And he was just really wonderful to work with. He wrote on the Iranian project that he did. So in terms of the Pritzker Prize, this was kind of another, as Milton said, when I always find that there's something that doesn't seem right, I try to use academia as a way to begin to investigate why are systems still the same, why things have not changed. And I think that this is a really good kind of beginning point, that mainstream architecture history and criticism does not incorporate discussions of class, race, religion, gender, or sexuality in reference to the producers of architecture. So in ignoring these differences between architects and their cultural contexts, it enables presentations of a homogeneous history. And so I find that seldom do we ever ask architects, where did you grow up? What did your parents do? So this idea that success and contributions does have kind of a linkage to origins or where they begin. It's kind of an important one. Or the idea that context, or to look at the presentations has been solely on the work itself and has been usually heroic, right? In terms of what is the standard of it having kind of credibility to even publish. So what we did last semester, the college, and it was basically a protest from the students asking RISD, why aren't students having a variety of coursework that deals with issues of diversity, that deals with issues of race? Why are we still teaching kind of a homogeneous view of history? And so I applied for the SEAI grant, which the college put forward to faculty in terms of an experimental course that touches on dismantling the canon or breaking the canon. And so our class basically, this is their mission, and they just finished the website yesterday or 2 days ago. And basically, the class of 9 students, 2 are from Brown University, 7 are from RISD. They put this statement together. With women in architecture, we have begun to tackle the massive erasure and exclusion of women in discourse around architecture in both education and practice. Institutional erasure is especially prevalent to both queer women and women of color. This is a collaborative database that would be a working document with the aim of eliminating the possibility for a person to continue to exclude women in architecture discourse due to lack of contextualized and centralized data. By researching and documenting these women, we are in the pursuit of responding to and resisting the systematic oppression that causes this exclusion in the first place. So our goal in the class is to simply, and I'll show you the website. You can actually write this website. It's womenarchitecture.com, and it's a working in process. So make sure that after you finish the semester, it will be ingoing process. So the goal that I put forward is really these 2 goals: to name both past and contemporary women architects. I found that no one can really name late 19th century, early, mid, or late 20th century. They could name some contemporary. So we put out a survey to all the students asking, without looking at sources, can you name 2 or 3 women architects? And you would probably know the answer. What was fascinating is to see that USC has a really great representation of female and male faculty. So that's a really kind of great beginning. But that was really the goal. Let's start naming some. And then the second one is to affirm that identity and culture are contributing factors to development of architecture form. So if I pause here just to show you the website. So we kind of put this together. I'll show you us. We took this picture because they knew that the deadline was, that I situated the deadline with this lecture so that I can at least offer it. So we put they did a basic line of timeline, 1920 to 1940, partnerships that basically there was in the 1940s, there was a lot of partnerships that happened because women to practice couldn't really necessarily be in the public realm. But if they were to be in the public realm, it was with their partners. And then we have 1940, 1960, 80, present, and we have, so if you scroll down, you can begin to see the early narratives of the modernist period. And this literally took 6 weeks of me kind of assembling all of the names as a kind of a platform and a framework for the students to go in and begin to do their case studies. So I just wanted to, this was really transformative for me because I was learning in that process. And it's been really transformative for the students. And I told the students that a lot of early narratives have been erased. There's no documentation. So we've had to really search very profoundly. And I think that is the role of the faculty and the student together collectively. I've been asking the students let's start today. I'm hoping that my 9 activist students are going to be doing their PhD in history. Because I think when we have women historian incorporating women of color and queer women and women in general, we'll start seeing a lot of change. So you can begin to see the resource here. I just wanted to kind of show you. And then I did contemporary practice, 1980 present, and this is a work in progress. And then we have a source, so you can read into it. So we're hoping that would be now an open source, developing an open source for everyone. So as Milton mentioned, we're the utopian visionaries, architecture of social exchange. When I put together the edited book of different contributors, my interest was to say, we understand we're a global practice, but it's not necessarily the single narrative anymore. It's a collective narrative, and it's of different places. And so how can a book be together to portray the various narratives that one has in terms of experiencing projects, social projects? In the book, I interviewed Simon Velez, and I learned 3 things from him. Colombian architect that works with bamboo. He gave me 3 advice that I would give to you that I've taken to heart. One is, give your work for free to the city. It allows for experimentation. The second one was, do not work with prefabricated materials. It robs people from work. It doesn't really embrace idea of craft or advanced craft in general. And then the third thing was import-export laborers. And I thought that was a really interesting concept because when he did the Zocalo Nomadic Museum in Mexico City, the Temper, he had to work with Mexicans and had to show them how to work with bamboo. And so what he did is he imported Colombian laborers with Mexican laborers, and they worked side by side. And what this did is this advanced the building technology. It advanced a cultural kind of sharing of information and advancement. So I found those 3 advices really fascinating. So Milton is a mentor of mine. When he was looking at our work, this literally, I don't know if he remembers, but this literally came from him, that Studio Lou's work is shaped by an embodying convention that form is a matter of architecture, but culture as shared by community groups is the subject matter of architecture. And I believe this very truly, that form is a resultant of shared experience. This is what I think form is, of shared experience. And with that, this is where the hammock and the Mattapan mobile farm stand, the public projects that we did with Brace, come into play. Everyone has seen those push carts of groceries in different cultures, right? And so I'll get back to that, but I wanted to kind of point this out first, that social difference and divisions are reinforced by the spatial organizations of city. Spatial borders reproduce economic, social, and cultural divisions. And before I tackle how do we begin to remove the spatialization or the racialized kind of systematic separations of let's say economy or economic productions within neighborhoods. This recently came out in December of 2000, at the end of December 2017, which is it was an investigative report about why Boston is a racist city. And in the Seaport, actually our office is in the Seaport, which you see there. And basically it says a brand new Boston, even whiter than the old. So how white? This white. So in the Seaport district is a new neighborhood. Tons of tax money was used to turn old railroad parking lots into a viable neighborhood. And so what is happening now is there's a big boom. Amazon, GE, everything is now going to the Seaport. And what was noted was that only 3 residential mortgages have been given to Black buyers in the Seaport in the main neighborhood. And I was also, during a research project this month, I ran across, so let me continue with this. So what happened to the Seaport is not just a failure to add a richly diverse neighborhood downtown. It is also an example of how the city's Black residents and businesses missed out on a considerable wealth created by the building boom. This is a city in which Blacks are almost a quarter of the population, and the tax dollars were part of what helped jumpstart the new Seaport. So what I found mind-blowing about this is that if the city planners today are not working through finding, let's say, social economic diversities in cities, who do we count on? Who do we trust? How do we work to remove injustice planning? And it makes sense why Boston is so segregated in terms of the neighborhood and districts. Like, what are systems out there, and how does one break that system? And so when I was doing a research project for a project, housing project, I show you, I ran across this image, and I was really blown away. I took it from the archives. It's a photo taken in 1979 in South End, Boston, and literally it was black owners catering to black club goers. It says here, this building is owned by a black man. His business will be run by a black man for the black man. So the reason why I found that really, it doesn't exist anymore. But what I found fascinating about that is that it's literally in your face. What building is owned by a black owner, or what building is owned by a white owner? And what makes it more challenging today is how do we really go uncovering? We have to really, because nothing is in the surface anymore, right? So it's really underground, and you have to like really go into much deeper. So going back to Mattapan Mobile Farm Stand, we were working in Mattapan, which is majority African American Caribbean population. It's about like 90%, but in that population, half are considered obese versus Boston, has a very good kind of health. But the idea that half the population were considered obese, we were looking at that. And we noticed that Mattapan was kind of a food desert. And we worked with a community partner to be able to begin to look at the issue of food deserts. How do we bring nutritious food to the neighbors, to the people? And so what we did is we said, okay, why don't we associate mobility with accessibility? And so I think that when I look at how to break through a certain, let's say, a segregated system, I think mobility might be a way to begin to intervene into creating, let's say, a leveling field. And so what we did is we created a mobile farm stand where we went from the train station to a park where people would play ball, to a senior center, and basically we organized with the youth group to ride this trike and bring food through these areas. And this was the youth group that we worked with, and we basically funded the youth group to learn how to ride this trike that it's like pounds of food, and it was important that they were safe. And we worked with Vivian. She was head of the existing kind of farmers market of the neighborhood. And so I did charrettes with the community. I worked with the community. We worked with a farm, and together. So this is Brace, and together we designed, with the community. We fabricated. We fundraised this whole project ourselves. We feel like financially it's a way to think out of the box and not rely on any other sources. And then basically it goes to the community members. So it's basically what you see here, transformer. It gets packed, it gets driven, and then it gets plotted into different areas, and food is distributed. These are like mail carriers. And then the latest one that we did was the tilt down fence. And this was in 2016 before the election and immigration was a big thing. If the hammock dealt with community and the mobile farm stand dealt with nutrition, the trustees or the board of directors basically said, let's now deal with issues of immigration. And so we looked at Dorchester, and the idea was simple. It's tilt down the fence to make a bridge. The idea was to create a metaphor climbing structure, climbing the economic ladder in which you can create upward mobility. So the idea is that if you have people within a group and they get to meet each other, they can use their own kind of networking to provide opportunities for jobs. And so the idea was to create really a social space. And so we use Redlex, which is what you make friendship bracelets out of, and we use our garage a lot to fabricate these installations. And here's basically, this was a little bit more complicated in terms of programming. So what we found interesting is to bring people there, we offered free ice cream. You get a lot of people coming to the public area. But it was a hook to start talking about the great contributions immigrants provide to the city of Boston. And we had literally like Boston Public Library come and do readings. We had live puppeteers. We worked with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Advancement, and we had sessions to show them legal services that were available to them. And then we also made another book. But this time we were dealing with the Vietnamese immigrant population. And we did a book which was called The Ladder Falls and Forms a Bridge in Vietnamese and in Spanish. And it talks about a poem. I can't speak English. True your parents' accent. Proud you should be and keep your head up. I don't like my fingers, Mom. Dear, you have stout hands that help with the chores and learn new knowledge. Proud you should be. Keep your head up. I don't like my eyes, Mom. Dear, you have a vision broad and far that has been this land and your ancestors' homeland. Proud you should be. And then at the end it says, I like myself, Mom. I like my accent. I like my fingers. I like my eyes. I like my figure. And above all, I like you very, very much. Proud I would be. Keep my heads up. So these were like a great moment for grandparents to read to their kids to build self-esteem. I find education and books and literature really important to go with projects. And then you can see the live puppeteers here. So the reason we worked in Dorchester is because this to me was astonishing that from 2000 to 2004, 1 in every 4 immigrant entering Massachusetts was from Asia, and of 9 in 10 were Vietnamese. And so here you begin to see, okay, how do you work with a site? And this is Boston, and you can begin to see that Dorchester has a large Vietnamese, Cape Verde, and it was a way to say, immigrants come from everywhere, and what you see in media is usually targeted to a particular group. And so this is my son. I have 2 kids, 6 and 3. And when we first put this out there, I wanted to ask, can we have an architectural expression of concept of immigration? How can we rethink the fence in terms of ideas of freedom belonging to place? How do you design a place of belonging for a changing culture group? So we start with lots of questions, and some of them, some might get, the others might say, what a crock of glorified poop, and that's okay, right? You always have people that like a project and people are going to be critical of it. What we learned from this project, because I take on all the liability myself, I take all the permits myself. What I learned about it is Dorchester doesn't have, first of all, where you need mostly public art is not in the places where you see them. It's usually where all the visitors and the tourists go. And what we realized in Dorchester and a lot of these vacant lands, they're owned by, so that the land that we picked was owned by Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. So a lot of public land is owned by the state because they are adjacent to train stations and so forth. And there is no communications with the state or the local city. So a lot of these lands just are not cared for. So that's what I kind of found is interesting in these areas. Okay, so now we look at, again, an experience that occurred to me when I was a student like yourself. We visited La Tourette in France, and in La Tourette, do you see these strip windows? Right? Have you been to La Tourette? Okay. You see the strip windows? So Le Corbusier used what? The modular man, right? The blue modular strip, which is how tall? Really tall, right? Like 6 foot. Like the blue versions, like with your hand up. And so if you're drawing an architecture using the modular man of very tall human figure, 6 figure, you see these strips here? I had to go like this, jump up and down, jump up, jump up. I couldn't experience what my colleagues were experiencing. This is the moment that I felt in architecture of exclusion. It exists. And how do you set up that process so you could be inclusive? So this next project is, we were asked to do the Multicultural Center, a space for descendants, for students of Asian descent, students for Latin descent, and LGBTQ of color. And what was fascinating about it is that this space came from a series of protests. And, you know, when I was going to school in the 90s at Cornell, there was protests from students. So change actually occurs from student protests. And in 2001, there was a hunger strike in Wellesley College. And they were, and you can begin to see, you know, we're done waiting, age your advisor now. They were requesting the college for advisors for the students of Asian descent or advisors for Latin descent. So when I came in the picture, they already had their advisors, which was a good thing. But now what tends to happen is they're all in this one group and there's no space. It gets used a lot, and there was no space where all of the students could come and congregate. So what was really fascinating about this process is when we were asked to do this institutional project, the way that we got this commission was interesting in itself. I went to a symposium, I don't know if Milton knows this, the Curating Race, and he had Liz Ogbu there. And I get a phone call from the director of facilities and says, and so the background was that the students also wanted a person of color to be their architect for the space. And they couldn't find anyone. And so Liz, she was on this planning facilities and said, what are you talking about? There's no architect of color. I know one, Studio Luz. And so what that network occurred at a conference at Michigan. And so my name was at least mentioned. I was still in competition with other architects, other women architects in Boston that were not women of color, but had done similar kind of community-based projects. And I won the commission outright from an interviewing process. But what was important is that looking came from the student. It didn't come from the top down. And so I was really appreciative to get my first institutional project. So it was a very political project, and I had to create focus groups with all the different groups because they were very pissed off at the administration. And as the architect, I had to be the negotiator of these two. So what do you like to happen here? Community. What do you not like to happen here? Conflict over space. What space makes you feel more included? Shoes off. So these focus group became the process for creating the programming in the space. Spaces without diversity in mind is something that makes them feel excluded. Anglo-centric makes them feel excluded. So I found this really, really interesting as a design process. So the collective voice helping me figure out how to begin to associate these spaces. So the original plan was in 1956. It was used for, it was a residence for a dean of students. And it was designed by Walter Pierce, and you can begin to see that they were considering it a historic structure. And what I found interesting in the design of this Walter Pierce is that Walter had a collaborator, his partner was Marion Fisker, and she was also a designer and artist. And it was another kind of conversation that I felt that I was having in terms of contemporary terms. How do I bring back the idea of printmaking? She was also a printmaker into this kind of design process. So we looked at tapestry and how do you begin to weave the different types of identities together, because I had to deal with different groups. And what's happening now in institutions is that I met with another institution, and one of the interesting dilemma now is like, how many micro identities do you now begin to design for? So this idea of negotiating identity, you know, what is let's say like the hierarchy in that is now a very good kind of question. So textile is a connective women culture. So what do these different groups, social groups have in common, or culture groups have in common? And so we looked at branding and graphic, and how, in terms of textile, the tradition of the Lao weaving in the Asian culture, how do we begin to use that as a way to kind of brand where their advisor office might be? Or the Japanese method of dyeing fabric, or the Mexican embroidery, to begin to talk about one portion in terms of that heritage. And then the LGBTQ equality. What tended to happen is that the groups did not want to be identified into this, but it was kind of a beginning, kind of departure point, and begin to make something that felt was theirs. If anything, they actually wanted just blank wall space, so they can contribute to the design of that space. So here you begin to see we had to work within an existing historic structure, and we just made it very flexible. So the idea that the entrance reception can close or open up to allow for much more intimate social gatherings. And then this is where some of their kind of contributions to that space. So we just kind of cleaned up, opened up, and tried to work with the historic and bringing it up to code. It was a very small project, but I felt it was a very important project because it was the type of projects that I felt very comfortable doing. And then lastly, in terms of housing, we started with kind of commercial restaurants, then we went into art installations, and then now that we're working on larger projects, how do we deal with issues of identity? And I think that the issues of identity at a much kind of larger scale, or negotiating identity, really deals with context and almost typology. And in Boston is a very kind of historic area. So what you see here is like, how does living change, or the way of living? I would say it depends on context. So if you're in the suburbs, your way of living is going to reference that. Or in terms of the urban context, whether you're living in a row house or apartment flat or in between buildings, it's very much a resultant of that neighborhood. So going back to World War II, women can now begin to be outside of the home. They can do many more different jobs. They had all of these different jobs, but they also had to be working within the role of being a mother. What I found fascinating was looking at the case study house in Arts and Architecture by Entenza, and you guys are very familiar with the case study house. But what I found interesting in looking at housing was how the kitchen and these social spaces have evolved. And what I think is wild is in the early case study houses, you would see here, that the positioning. So during World War II, women was liberated, they can do more things, but then you have these experimental housing and media, and how media and representation began to box in the woman again to its traditional, supposedly conventional roles. And I think that was really damaging. So you can begin to see here in the case studies house, the man and wife leave together in the morning, dressing activities have been provided by two separate dressing. The kitchen is adjacent to the dressing bedroom wing. By this arrangement, Ms. X can attend easily the preparation of breakfast and quick meals while dressing or working at the bedroom desk. So you can begin to see here, here's a master bedroom, here's a men's wardrobe, and here's a woman right next to the kitchen. So she can get ready and go right next to the kitchen. And I'm not sure if you guys discussed this in the case studies house, but I found, okay, so we go from the adjacencies of these rooms to now looking at the kitchen as a surface for conversation, where the woman has to both host and prepare meals at the same time and have a conversation. And so we begin to see the kitchen and the flexibility of the kitchen beginning to open up into the living space. And then, so then now you see food preparation as the heart of the living room. So now is part of the larger kind of social space. It's no more a categorization of its own. And you can see Case Study House 4. Here you can begin to see that in these quadrants that it takes up the same amount of program space. So now it is part of the larger social space as a heart. But then look at the representation, and it uses a mammy, right? The nanny, overweight with large breasts, hair, the way that they're stereotyping. And look at this gigantic baby in its representation, right? So who has power here? So here, media representation, I think. In terms of the kitchen type, I think that's where we are today. Like, you either now see it as utilitarian in terms of whether it's in an urban context and it needs to be small, compact, or whether it's a larger social space. In this housing project, the kitchen here is part of that large social gathering space. So this is the design process in our office. This is a house for my partner and I. And we couldn't agree to the house, and we did all these plans, and it literally took us like 2 years to come into negotiation about what the house should be like because we couldn't agree. And there's my son and my daughter, and basically this is in Boston, in Rosendale. We didn't want to move to the suburb. It's a very small lot. It's like 20 by 40, 3,200 square feet. And it's about 1,800 square foot of living. And we wanted to design a house that was affordable and sustainable. And so what we did here is basically we created this vertical kind of shaft space that pulled all the heat up to the top. It's all electrical. We used heat pumps. This is where they play. This is a balcony where you always see them. The play and centralization, the social, is always kind of the center of the house. And this is when the house, before value engineering, when it was 3 stories. And the only thing that was not incorporated was the super insulated wall system. It was twice the amount. So we just used really great German insulated windows. And did all electric heat pumps and tankless water heater. And then this is the back. So it's very compact. So we basically used the view of our neighbor. And the back is a little bit much more glazing. Where the side, where you see kind of the neighborhood, it's mostly closed in. And then in terms of the south end, this is a building. This is a 45,000 square foot building where we had to incorporate 40 residential units and 30 parking space. And the tricky thing about this was that this is a historic district of South End. We had to negotiate the Victorian row house with the neo-Renaissance building. And there had been like 3 developers, and they couldn't get it passed through the city. And the developer came to us and asked us to help them with the project. So during a lot of the community meetings, this is what happened. People wanted Oreos, and we were like, what are Oreos? So we found out that Oreos were simply just a projection that you would see. And it brought me back to kind of the theories from various architects that I had studied, like the way that Lina Bombardi uses the window to create ventilation, light and air to pass through. I thought of Auguste Perret, French architect that used the window anthropomorphically of the whole human body. So the idea was that you were inside the frame, within the city, overlooking the city. I looked at Lowe's, where glazing is just to let light in, Corb's cinematic kind of window to not break the view, and then Eiley Gray use of window of flexibility. So I found it really fascinating that just through your your idea about a window basically talked about the identity of the architect, how one practiced. We went with Auguste Perret's usage of the urban window. And so this is what, out of many iterations, we did a 6-story structure. You actually don't see the penthouses in the back here. And we had to, so here's the projected Oriel window that basically participated part of the urban environment. And we used a terracotta system. And we went very detailed at the base, so to have a human scale, and then we created different treatments. Boston's obsessed with the cornice, so this cornice just really looks at the sky. And we had to produce these historic kind of line drawings to convince the city how it was contextual, how it carried on the roll rhythm, and how it carried on the base, middle, and top to the building. So we consider ourselves modern architects, but when you're working in Boston, where most of the neighborhood is historic, we find that if you're a good architect, you can make it work with different identities, different typologies. So the units are pretty much back to when it goes, you have units that are front to back, and then you have a diversity of 2 to 3 bedroom units. And then you have then the penthouse, which are 2 units in themselves. And then the back looks of a Roxbury community garden. So it's in the border of South End, Roxbury. And then the next site is Bay Village, Piedmont Park Square, which the lot now is about 20,000 square foot and is 8 residential units and 10 parking spots. And Bay Village basically is bounded by the Back Bay, South End, and the Theater District. And this lot was kind of plagued by a huge fire. 400 people basically died. It was called the Coconut Grove, and it sparked a whole bunch of code changes. And no one wanted to touch that site. It was turned into a parking lot. No one wanted to touch it because they thought it was, people were afraid to build anything on a sacred site where 400 people died in the 1940s. And so the developer, we did all the drawings. We did some schematic to construction documents. Here's the site right here. And majority, it's a historic district. A majority are 3 to 4 stories. And then this is not historic, and you start getting into much more higher, 5 or more stories. And we had to show how this project was going to reference the historic, so we had to look at typology, the townhouse typology. Only the corner could be expressive, basically on the historic landmark guidelines. Only the corner. This is crazy, right? Like systems, and you have to kind of work in these systems. So only the corners can be expressed. And then you have the Oriels and projections come back, and then you have the main entry. And so our strategy was to create 4 townhouses and 4 apartment flats to create 8 units. And then you have the Oriels coming back, and then the corner was the only place that could be expressive. So we try to push the envelope a little bit. So we pushed a little bit the envelope with this one. And this is what we built. Well, not us directly, but the contractor. And you can begin to see that the row houses, even though it's a large single block, we created 2 different distinctions between brick and color. And the corner are these kind of dovetail corner conditions. You can begin to see here. So these are more like the living spaces. And we try to express the difference between them through different types of like stack bonds, running bonds. We call this the zipper material. This is the lobby. I'm going kind of fast now. And then going up to the roof. And then this property, developers also bought this property. So what happens when you're doing a project, other neighbors start saying, I'll let you do this project if you buy my own project, or you have to like negotiate. So we're now in the process of doing this project, this right next to it, which you see here. These two structures, we're now proposing about a 10,000 square foot residential addition to the two-story structures, where the first floor is commercial. All of these is residential, but this one is commercial, and the top will be residential. And literally, this is like hot off the press. This was our March 16th historic presentation, where we're trying to convince historic commissioner that they should give us a 6-story, but that area is mostly 4 stories. So we're showing them renderings of how this should match. Oh, look, we have a corner condition. You see this base? We noted that this base was an odd with the neighborhood, and so we thought this was not of its original use. And so we had to, I was able to find images of what it used to be based on the coconut fire, because it was a well archived project. And so you can begin to see that all of this was infilled in, but you basically just see mostly windows. So this is what we presented. Like, we're gonna give you this. We're gonna bring it back to historic, but let us be a little bit more loose at the top. Let's be a little bit more. We're kind of like pushing them a little bit. And so the idea here is, forget the categorization of the punctured window with the masonry construction. Let's just say the window is the surface. And so this is what, this is, and basically in these developer projects, we're always just giving them this utilitarian kitchen. And so that's our latest one. So we're in this beginning phase. And then lastly, what does a unit look like when it's one of those 40 units? And this is when you're constrict with, let's say, a 1,200 square foot space. How do you deal with flexibility? And this is where we then now use surfaces to begin to distinguish rooms. Like, so this is entering into the master bedroom. And here is like a little office, but it can be closed to create different kind of functions for the owners. And then when you have a party, it can expand. So basically, in conclusion, is how you live is really dependent on context, and specifically in Boston, how do you begin to negotiate the types that are around it to make an argument for your work? And that's it. Right. I think that was an hour. Try to be fast. Huh? Oh, questions, please. Yes. You did, great. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So neighborhood communities have a lot of say in that process. So when you have areas like what tends to happen, which is difficult, is that the developers start buying out. So I don't know if I don't know how to necessarily answer that, because I'm not the city to say, what's going to happen. But I would say that Chinatown is a very kind of organized community, but it only works within certain parcels or buildings. The difficulties is when you start having developers buying out individual owners quietly. But there's no protection area that I am aware of. Architecture First probably just won commissions. So we're part of that unfortunate gentrification process. But there's a great TED Talk by the architect I just mentioned, Liz Olsbu, who talks about, rather than gentrification, let's talk about healing as a way to make planners aware that they're being kind of short-sighted. So you should look at that TED Talk. Maybe you can go back and be an activist. Yes.
Tactics of working around the sort of Euro-Western-centric canon as an educator and as a practicing architect. I mean, it seems to me in Boston that's an especially challenging thing to approach when the historical context demands that much of the sort of architecture exists within that sort of
Well, how do I think about looking within that canon? So that's great. I thought about that, and I didn't frame these three things, but the negotiating identity title, I actually borrowed it from an author, James Cummins, and he has a book called Negotiating Identity, Education for Empowering in a Diverse Society. And I would say the tactics that he frames in his book within the educational system, let's say of poor students, can be applied to our our educational system in terms of the architects, and also professionally. And the three things that he outlines is, one is respect students' language and culture. So I would say that either the planners or the professors have to be in an environment of practice or education that we respect automatically this idea of students' language and culture. And the second one is encourage community participation in whatever way that is. That community participation, voices, is part of that process. And I think I made a case for Wellesley, like creating these focus groups literally created the footprint for the plan making. And then the third one is institute forms of the reverse patterns of underrepresentation. So what that means is that as faculty, we have to find a way to incorporate assessment tools to reverse, discrimination practices or systematic racism. And that's why we created a survey to our student body that just simply asked them two questions, which is list a contemporary architect, female architect, and the second was list a architect in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, as an assessment tool to make a case and put it public that we have to do we have some work to do. I hope that's helpful, and I think the same goes for practice. Those that have power in them to make collective decisions that would affect a neighborhood. Yes.
I saw like some of your early projects, you had a lot of you had two projects that I'm thinking of where there was like bar tops that were untrimmed, raw, with slab edges. And the overall shape was it looked like it was really intentional. It was drawn in plan. I was just wondering, when you go about that, did you design that in and then go shopping, or did you go shopping and then like what you saw?
So there's two of them. One was a half trunk, which was a bar in Diva, and the other one was a slab with the rough edges in Harpoon, right?
Yeah.
So
the whole thing was kind of bowed out, right?
yeah, so we didn't shop for that. So when I frame that our office tries to link social concepts with built material expression, and whether it's legible or not, the way that we try to do that is to make people, bring them into kind of a conscious being of where things come from. So the idea of wood, it's not just a veneer. So when we think of wood, we look at it on its before it gets dried, right? The water, like in its natural form, whether it's a trunk, whether it's a piece. So we have that idea, and then we work with the crafts. One of the things we do is we work with crafts people in the area. So whether they're from Vermont or from Massachusetts, it's painful for the client and for us because when you work with craftspeople, I'm trying just to give them business, give them work. I'm always very conscious of that. The process is longer, and construction process is typically shorter. Yes.
Well, thank you for this. This was very nice.
Nice, I like that.
A question that I had was for one of your projects, it was kind of you had two identities in your building. You know, the historical foot arcade, and then the glass modern box.
At the top, yep.
And so, if you're negotiating constantly behind the buildings, does that bring the conversation of negotiating public space versus densified housing growth? Because how could you densify when you make so many good public spaces?
When you say public spaces, do you mean? Oh, I'm not sure if I understand your question. By the way, the glass top. I showed that to you earlier, and the Mass Ave, the 40 unit, we did like 100 iterations, and the developer at that time said, if we weren't going through an economic crisis, you would have been fired by now, meaning there was no construction happening in 2007, 2008. But what we were trying to do was we were trying to change historic commission's view of what historic is. And I think at the end, it'll be interesting to see if we can convince Historic Landmark to have contradiction with, a historic base in the, because they're very, very restringent, like in terms of their aesthetics. But I don't know if I understand your question in terms of public, because public, when you do public art, is inherently temporary. So I'm not sure if I understand your questions about densification.
So don't you think you're negotiating their public space? They had a feeling memorial to the site. Isn't that a part of their identity?
Oh, you mean the Coconut Grove site, like when nothing was happening? Yeah, yeah. I mean that was part also perhaps maybe why that project was not being developed over a long time, because it was a collective memory. So at the very end, there was a Boston Globe article. There was a plaque on site, and we moved the plaque to the sidewalk. And but at some point, is this being recorded? It's probably being recorded. Let's just say there was a big Globe article saying, "Where is the plaque?" And we had to say, "Put the plaque back." What are you doing? But yeah, so the reason that project got developed is because time had passed long enough that it was okay.
Was there conversations at all about referring to what happened, or was it kind of like let's kind of forget about the other people? I can imagine it's kind of a morbid memory.
Yeah, I think so some cultures didn't touch it. Like I had another client that's Chinese and was like, I'm never gonna buy. I was trying to convince him to buy a unit. He's like, I would never buy a unit in that property. The people that bought on that property are like millennials or like just young professionals that want to be in the city, because the units are tight, right? The only public space they have is like a roof deck or a little balcony. Mm-hmm.
I think your presentation kind of demands a kind of very direct kind of comment, and I think I find your way of describing your work difficult and badass. And I want to ask you a very direct question. And I find that right now there's a real change in architecture schools, in architectural conversations. It has to do with race and inclusion, and it makes me think oddly the 1980s when there was a kind of culture war and a kind of anti-canon movement in the humanities, in English or comparative literature, etc. What was it about architecture that made it so good at resisting that thing that was seemingly addressed so directly 35 years ago? And I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder, is it the 2016 election that somehow wakes things up? Or I can't figure out why it lasted so long or why it's changing now. And I'm wondering.
Meaning the removal of women in general just didn't catch on to the other disciplines. There's reasons for that. And then is it 2016 that is now saying this has to stop, and now you're seeing more of the conversation. So I'll answer the first one, which is, this is part of our conversation. I'm glad to hear that is happening at USC, but I can tell you that's happening in the East Coast. And when I first post on Facebook, because our friends or colleagues, that I was putting together a seminar, I had other women that I knew that were teaching at Parsons and at Brown University that said, hey, I'm doing this too. And what I found interesting about Kim Acker, that's teaching at Parsons, a women's seminar, is that she's a practitioner. She's a solo practitioner in New York City. And we share syllabi, so we can compare notes. And she's positioning it from a practice point of view. What I'm finding is also Ito Han, a theorist at Brown, was surveying, cataloging all the women architects in Rhode Island. And so what I found is that it wasn't historians necessarily, like it was just regular people, practitioners that said, I had enough, like, or seeing in conversations with both men and women, like the disappointment that their analysis precedents are still 99% white male, or that they can have 3 precedents of Le Corbusier and only one project from the usual Eileen Gray, Alina Bombardi, like that there wasn't more of that. So I think it's not happening that in institutions that I see. In terms of like the feminist wave, and I've looked at a lot of writings from Despina Strategakis, who's leading a lot of this conversation. She basically says there's been like these 3 waves of feminism, and one of the reasons why it hasn't kind of caught on is, and there was an examinations of the anthologies of theory books that has been put out, like 6 or 7 anthologies, theory books, that out of these 6 or 7 books, there's been only like 6 essays from those 6 books, and they've pigeoned it into like one genre versus a movement. So, for example, let's say post-structuralism, like just the idea of, let's say, feminist theory and space should be a genre as similar to like post-structuralism or as a way of practicing versus being marginalized into like one movement because it gets forgotten. The other thing that we've notice is what I've noticed, and I've told the students, is that the work starts today. So, meaning we already acknowledge that a lot of the work has been removed or discarded, not collected or archived. So, let's say if we work on a present, it's still not being put together out there or demonstrated out there. In terms of analysis, precedents, but at the very end, a way to check yourself would just say, let's just have equal representation, period, in terms of quantity. So quantity actually, what I've noticed is that quantity actually matters, and if we just keep just having 2 or 1, it's never going to catch that equity or that movement. Great. Thanks, guys. I know you're hungry. Thank you.
I'll give him what I have. I'll give him what I have.